The gymnasium on Beaudry Avenue in Los Angeles sat at the end of a block that smelled of cut grass and diesel, 2 miles from the downtown skyline, on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1967. It was the kind of building that absorbed sound rather than reflected it. Low ceilings, concrete walls painted the dull, institutional green of government surplus. 61 folding chairs arranged in 3 uneven rows along one side of the floor. Every chair was occupied. Men sat with their arms folded across their chests or rested their elbows on their knees the way serious practitioners sit when they are watching something they intend to remember. The challenger's name was Marcus Webb. He was 26 years old. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall and weighed 211 pounds, none of it soft. He had trained under the Pan American heavyweight contact karate champion for 4 consecutive years. He held a black belt in Shotokan and a brown sash in judo, and he had fought in formal competition 11 times and won 11 times, the last 4 by way of early stoppage. The opponents unable to continue. In the months preceding that Tuesday afternoon, Webb had made a point of visiting 3 separate martial arts schools in the Los Angeles area, issuing open challenges and collecting the concessions that followed. Nobody had made him breathe hard. He had requested this gathering. He had organized it himself, calling in favors from 2 tournament directors he knew and circulating the invitation through 6 established martial arts clubs across the basin. He had one specific purpose. He intended to prove something. Not to the 61 men in the folding chairs, exactly, to himself, perhaps, or to an idea he had been carrying for long enough that it had begun to feel like a debt. At the far end of the gymnasium floor, in the 4th row of chairs, a smaller man sat with his arms loose at his sides. He wore a plain white t-shirt and dark trousers. His shoes were leather, low-cut, built for walking rather than sparring. His hands were resting open on his thighs. He was watching Webb move through his warm-up forms with the patient attention of someone who had already read the last page of the book. In the next 22 seconds, everything Marcus Webb believed about the distance between reputation and truth would be corrected. Nobody in that gymnasium believed they were about to witness something they would still be repeating 30 years later. But they were, and the sentence Bruce Lee would speak at the end of it would redirect the remainder of that young man's life. Stay until the end. Marcus Webb had not arrived at that gymnasium by accident. He had arrived at it through accumulation, through 4 years of early mornings and late evenings, through a discipline that was not performed for an audience but maintained in private, through the kind of repetition that restructures the body at a level below thought. The men in those chairs understood this because they had done some version of it themselves. They had felt the particular exhaustion of a year spent learning a single block until it arrived without instruction. They knew what Webb had given to become what he was, and they respected it the way tradesmen respect another man's precision. He was not a fool, he was not a braggart in the common sense. He had won 11 times in formal competition because he had earned 11 victories. His Shotokan was clean, his footwork was economical, his rear hand carried weight that could and had rearranged the expectations of serious fighters. One of the tournament directors who had received his invitation later said that watching Webb spar was like watching a very good argument, structured, purposeful, and difficult to find an opening in. But there was something else, a certainty that had grown alongside the technique, watered by the victories and the concessions. The kind of certainty that stops asking questions because it has decided it already has the answers. This is not a character flaw in the ordinary sense, it is almost a requirement of serious competition. A man who doubts himself at speed loses, but taken to its far edge, it hardens into something that cannot learn anything new because it has already decided what is true. Webb had decided something about Bruce Lee. He had read the magazines, he had seen the photographs. He had watched the interviews Lee gave, with the camera cutting close on his hands and his eyes and his concentrated expression. He had watched Lee demonstrate techniques for journalists in parking lots and television studios. And he had measured what he saw against what he knew from 11 fights and 4 years of dedicated training. He had decided the gap was smaller than advertised. He had decided that a great deal of what surrounded Bruce Lee was the architecture of presentation, the speed, the certainty, the philosophical language. He had told one of the tournament directors, in a private conversation the week before that he believed a serious student in the room could test the distance between the story and the man. The tournament director had not agreed out loud, but he had not argued either. This is what brought him to that floor on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1967, working through his warm-up forms in front of 61 men who were watching carefully enough that the gymnasium had achieved a specific quality of silence. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of attention. There is a difference. The first kind does not cost anything. The second kind is expensive. Webb finished his warm-up and straightened. He walked to the center of the floor and asked that the building be quiet. Then he took the microphone that the tournament director had set up for exactly this kind of address, because Webb had planned this, down to the microphone, and he held it in his left hand and said what he had come to say. He said Bruce Lee's name. He said it clearly so every man in the building could hear. He said that he had spent 4 years studying under a champion. He said that he had been in 11 fights and had not lost one. He said he intended no disrespect by what he was about to propose. Then he said it. He said, the man whose name everyone says should put his technique on the floor where technique gets proven. Not in a magazine, not in front of a camera. Here, he did not say it loudly. He said it at the volume of a man who does not need volume because he believes the content will do the work. He looked in the direction of the fourth row, and there was a silence then that was different from the one before it. This one had weight. If you want to find out what happened in the next 22 seconds, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. The man in the fourth row did not move immediately. He sat with his hands still open on his thighs, looking at the center of the floor where Marcus Webb was standing with the microphone. And the 61 men in the folding chairs were doing what people do in the moment before something clarifies. They were very still, and their stillness was its own kind of statement. Then Bruce Lee stood up. He did not stand up the way a man stands up when he is angry, or when he has been startled, or when he is performing readiness for an audience. He stood up the way a man stands up when he has been sitting for long enough and it is time to stop sitting. His hands came off his thighs. He straightened his back. He reached down with one hand and picked up the jacket he had folded across the empty chair beside him, and he folded it again, once, precisely along the existing crease. And he set it on the chair he had been sitting in with the collar facing up. Then he walked toward the floor. He did not walk at the pace of a man with something to prove. He walked at the pace he always walked. Through the gymnasium, something was moving from chair to chair. Not a sound, an adjustment. Men were leaning forward by small fractions of an inch. A tournament official who was standing against the far wall later described it as watching a current move through standing water, a ripple that began in the back row and traveled silently to the front. These were trained practitioners. They had watched thousands of rounds of contact sparring. They knew technique when they saw it, and they knew reputation. And in most cases they understood that these two things are not always the same, but they had seen the way that smaller man had walked from the fourth row to the gymnasium floor, and something in the quality of that walk had already begun to adjust their arithmetic. He stopped 8 feet from Marcus Webb. He looked at him with the particular directness that people who had met Bruce Lee would later consistently describe as the most difficult thing about being in proximity to the man. Not the speed, not the knowledge, but the attention. The quality of being seen entirely without any courtesy being extended in the direction of your self-concept. He said 2 words. He said, "Don't test me." The voice was flat. It did not rise at the end. It contained no warning because it required none. It was simply an accurate statement about the relationship between what was about to be offered and what would be received in return. Webb looked back at him. He was 26 years old and 211 pounds, and he had not lost 11 times in competition. He adjusted his feet. He said he had no intention of holding back. He said that was the point. Bruce Lee nodded once. He said, "Don't test me." The second time he said it, the gymnasium was so quiet that a man in the third row later said he could hear the fluorescent light above the door buzzing at the frequency that fluorescent lights buzz. Webb moved first. A contest between 2 fighters is not what it appears to be from the outside. From the outside, it looks like 2 bodies colliding in space. From the inside of the man who has trained long enough that his training has become his nervous system, it is a conversation about distance. Distance is the grammar of every martial exchange. Too close and a man cannot generate force. Too far and he cannot arrive before the answer. The intermediate space, the precise interval at which the committed strike arrives just as the commitment becomes irreversible, is the subject of every drill, every repetition, every early morning and late evening that a serious student gives to the work. This is the thing that cannot be understood by watching. It must be lived in the body. Webb understood distance. He had understood it for 4 years. His control of the entry interval, the 18 to 24 inches inside which a strike transitions from potential to unavoidable, was what had earned him 11 victories against 11 serious opponents. He knew the grammar. He had used it to end conversations before they became arguments. The difference was that Bruce Lee did not live at the same address. Second one. Webb's right foot drove forward off the rear leg with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has repeated the motion 10,000 times until the repetition became the motion itself. His lead hand came up in the classical Shotokan guard. His eyes were level. The commitment was clean and it was real, not tentative, not exploratory. Webb had decided, in the fraction of a second before his foot left the floor, that he was going to close the 8 feet between them and find out what happened on the other side. The man standing across from him moved. The word moved is not sufficient. Webb moved too. What happened was different in kind. Lee's weight transferred from his rear foot to his lead foot in the way that a shadow relocates when the sun moves, not in the manner of something that begins and travels and arrives, but in the manner of something that is simply in one place and then in another. His angle changed by 43 degrees, not backward, laterally, forward, and to the outside. So that the architecture of Webb's attack, perfectly designed and honestly committed, arrived in the space where a body had been and was not anymore. The right foot landed on nothing. Webb adjusted. This is what a serious practitioner does when his first entry finds nothing. He resets, he recalculates, he comes again. He found the new line. His rear hand came up from the hip with the turning shoulder behind it, the full mass of 211 pounds channeling through that point of contact. The punch was real. It was the kind of strike that had, in 11 previous encounters, corrected the arithmetic of 11 previous opponents. Second 3. Lee's left forearm met the incoming right forearm not at the wrist but 4 inches above it, at the point where the arm is already committed but the force has not yet concentrated. The contact was brief, it redirected rather than absorbed, the way a river rock redirects water, not by stopping it but by being placed precisely where the water intended to go. Webb's punch landed 2 inches outside the shoulder of the man it had been sent to find. A tournament director sitting in the front row later described what he saw in that moment. He said he did not realize he had put both hands flat on his knees until he noticed them there. Webb gathered himself. He had trained for this. The capacity to absorb the failure of an attack and find the next one without panic is exactly what 4 years of serious training is supposed to produce. He found it. He measured the new distance. His lead foot stepped laterally to recover the angle that the first 2 seconds had taken from him, and he came forward again with a combination, lead hand to establish the distance, rear hand to finish it. Second 5. The lead hand found the space between them and arrived where it was aimed, and Bruce Lee was not there. He had not retreated. He had not stepped back into the larger space behind him. He had rotated along the inside of the entry, so that the lead punch passed his ear at a distance the tournament director later estimated at 4 inches. And in the geometry of that rotation, Lee was no longer in front of Webb, but beside him and marginally behind, in the specific quadrant of space that a man in forward commitment cannot protect. He did not strike. He could have. Every person in those 61 chairs understood this in the same instant. The geometry was available. The finishing technique was open. Webb's momentum was forward and his balance was ahead of his base, and the angle of approach was clear and undefended. He did not take it. He stepped back to 8 feet. He stood in the same position he had been standing in at the beginning. His hands were down at his sides. He looked at Webb with the same quality of attention he had offered at the start. The gymnasium did not make a sound. 3 things happened in the 6 seconds that followed. The first was that Marcus Webb straightened out of his fighting stance. Not completely. His weight stayed low the way a trained body keeps its weight low even when the conscious mind is doing something else. But his shoulders came back by a fraction and his chin lifted by a fraction. And these small adjustments were the body's version of a question. The second was that the tournament director in the front row picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. The third was that Bruce Lee walked forward. Not to attack, he walked forward the way you walk towards someone you need to say something to. He stopped at the distance a man stops when what he is about to say is meant for one person and not for 61. He extended his right hand, palm up, open, not a fighting offer. A different kind of offer. He said one sentence. He said it at the volume of a man talking to one person. The men in the folding chairs could not hear the words. They could hear the cadence, brief, flat, unhurried. Afterwards, several of them would ask Webb what had been said. Some of them were still asking, years later. What Bruce Lee said in the private interval between them was this: "The technique is good. The certainty will cost you more than any opponent." Webb stood with the extended hand in front of him. And he stood at the fork in the road that opens in front of every man who has been corrected honestly and in full view of his peers, and the choice at that fork is simple and it is permanent. A man can look at what happened clearly and accept it as information. Or he can build a structure of explanation around it until the information is no longer available. Webb looked at Bruce Lee for a long moment. Then he took the open hand in both of his and held it briefly and said something back. He said, "I understand." Those were the words, 2 of them. He turned and walked back to the center of the floor, and he bowed to the gymnasium in the formal way of a man who has been trained in formal ceremony. And then he picked up his gear bag from beside the chairs and he walked to the exit, and he opened the door and he left. The tournament director, who was standing against the far wall, put his clipboard under his arm and walked across the floor to where Bruce Lee was standing. He put his hand on Lee's shoulder briefly, and he did not say anything. Lee nodded once. Then he picked up his jacket from the 4th row chair where he had left it, and he put it on, and he walked out of the gymnasium on Boudry Avenue into the spring afternoon where the traffic was moving on the boulevard and the light was falling on the concrete in the flat, even way that light falls on concrete that has no particular interest in what has just happened nearby. The story did not stay in that gymnasium. It left on the lips of 61 men, and 61 men went back to 61 dojos and training halls and back rooms and dinner tables, and they told it in the way that witnesses tell things they have seen that they are still organizing. In the first version, the 22 seconds became 18. In a later version, they became 35. The crowd of 61 became, in one retelling, nearly 200. This is how true things travel. They gain detail in some places and lose it in others, and the parts that survive the longest are not always the most accurate parts. They are the most emotionally coherent parts. The parts that make the shape of the story feel right. What survived across every version, in every telling for the 30 years that the story circulated through the martial arts communities of California and beyond, was the moment after the 22 seconds. Not the movement. Not the angle. Not the geometry of 3 failed entries against a man who did not have to take a single step backward. What survived was the extended hand. And the one sentence. And the 2 words that came back. Marcus Webb did not become a cautionary tale. He became a practitioner of a different kind. He trained for another 18 years. He opened a school in the San Fernando Valley in 1973 and ran it for 11 years. He was known by the students who trained under him in that period for one specific thing he said at the beginning of every new student's training. He said, "Certainty is not the same thing as skill. Skill asks questions. Certainty has already stopped." Several of his students later said they did not know when they first heard the line where it came from. It was only when they were senior students, or when they had left the school and gone on to their own practices, that they asked. And Webb told them. He told them about a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1967 and a gymnasium on Boudry Avenue and a smaller man in a white t-shirt who sat in the 4th row with his hands open on his thighs. He told them that the most important thing he learned in his career was not a technique. He told them it was the distance between what a man is certain he knows and what the floor will teach him. There is a lesson in that gymnasium that is not about martial arts. A man who has earned his certainty through genuine labor, through years of serious, unglamorous work, still faces the moment when the work itself becomes the ceiling. The championship that should open the next door starts to function as the last door. The record that should be a floor to build from starts to be a wall to stand behind. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of attention. It is the specific failure of a man who has stopped noticing what is actually in front of him, because he has already decided. Bruce Lee stood 8 feet from that failure and did not punish it. He corrected it. He handed it back without flourish, without an audience, in one sentence at a volume only one man could hear. This is the specific courtesy of a teacher, not the courtesy of politeness, the courtesy of precision, giving a man exactly what he needs and nothing more. Webb took it. He walked out through the door, and he spent the next half-century proving that the taking was real. The story a man tells about what he is capable of and the thing he is actually capable of at speed, these are not always the same story. The floor is where the difference gets settled. In the next episode on this channel, we will be talking about what happened the night Steve McQueen challenged a man he had never met in a parking lot on Sunset Boulevard, and the 44 seconds that followed, and why McQueen never spoke publicly about the martial arts again.